So we were talking about the ecclesiology of the 20th century, which was the century of the discussions about the church. And among other topics, like foundational and evidential ecclesiology, we mentioned also transtraditional ecclesiologies. Ecclesiologies that try to preach different traditions, Christian traditions like Catholic, Protestant traditions, like Orthodox, and other Christian traditions. This bridging became possible as a part of the ecumenical movement, which we will discuss in detail today. The ecumenical movement tried to produce an ecclesiology which would be common for different Christian traditions. To construct a building from the elements taken from each tradition and which would satisfy, would be accepted by different traditions. So it's, the ecumenical ecclesiology is essentially about building a new construction, a new house, as it were. At the same time, there was a different approach to bridging different traditions. Not to build a new house, but to try to connect existing houses by creating a language which would be understandable by the inhabitants of each house. Okay? So far, we lived in different houses. We didn't understand pretty much each other. The two approaches that were developed in the 20th century was either to build a new house where people would, converse with each other and learn each other's kind of ideas and languages, or to let them stay in their own houses and at the same time to make them speaking the same languages. Those languages are transtraditional. And among those languages, one of the most popular was and still is the language of Eucharistic ecclesiology. This language is centered on Eucharist. Who can explain me what is Eucharist? Eucharistia, yeah, in Greek.
Providing thank yous.
Yes, it's about thanksgiving.
Yeah.
Eucharistia is literally in Greek means giving thanks, right? Or thanking someone. Yes, it's about thanksgiving. And what happens when Eucharist is served in the church? Yes.
Isn't it supposed to be like Jesus is living?
Yes. In which form?
You mean through the bread and the wine?
Yes. Yeah, body and blood of Christ. That is the essence of the Eucharist. And Eucharist is celebrated in every Christian tradition. There is a Catholic Eucharist, which is accomplished, performed during the Mass. There is Eucharist also in the Protestant traditions, different Protestant traditions, all of them. There is Eucharist in the Eastern traditions as well. So every single tradition has Eucharist. And because of that, there was an attempt exactly to bridge those traditions by invoking, by referring to Eucharist. Even though Eucharist is not shared by all those traditions, so that the Catholics have their own Eucharist, they don't share the Eucharist with others. Orthodox have their own Eucharist, they don't share this Eucharist with others, and so forth, but all of them have Eucharist at least. And they have an idea about Eucharist, a certain idea which is more or less common. And on the basis of this common idea, they try to build a language which would bridge different traditions. And this is called Eucharistic ecclesiology. Its basic idea is that Eucharist is the basement, it's the foundation of the church. For the first time, this idea was uttered by a Catholic theologian, Hans Urs von Balthasar, who said that Eucharist makes the church, not the other way around. In the past, the common belief was that it is the church which produces Eucharist. Balthazar's point was that it is Eucharist that produces the church, and that therefore, if we have a common perception of Eucharist, and if we eventually arrive at common celebration of Eucharist, we can reunite churches, because Eucharist is foundational for the church. Even though the Eucharistic ecclesiology was first articulated by a Catholic theologian, it became particularly popular among the Orthodox theologians. And it is a sort of mainstream Orthodox ecclesiology nowadays, which is good. Eucharistic ecclesiology became also important for the Protestant traditions, even though the Protestant churches do not emphasize Eucharist to the same extent as it is emphasized in the Catholic or in the Orthodox traditions. And therefore we can say that it is a kind of trans-traditional movement to appreciate and to think in the same way about Eucharist. Another common idea which produced a language bridging different traditions is the idea of personhood. This idea became a basis of the personalistic ecclesiology. It is based on the concept of person, an important concept that emerged or dominated philosophy in the 20th century. In the 20th century, personalism became a philosophical movement, trend that pierced through different philosophical schools. It originated from the Christian philosophy, but spread beyond the Christian philosophy, became really an important philosophical concept for many philosophical schools. The events of the 20th century fostered this concept to develop, to be adopted by different schools. Particularly the two world wars that where millions of people perished as a result of the wars and of the ideologies of communism, primarily Nazism, that valued masses, commonality more than an individual person, than individual rights, produced as a kind of counterweight to those ideologies of masses and to the mass destruction that happened in the World War IIs, the idea of personhood as something extremely valuable, that every single unique person has a unique and unsurpassable value. Philosophers from different schools, first in France, but then later on also in the United States, with two distinct schools of personalistic philosophy in Boston and in California, developed the concept of person that was theological. This concept of person suggested that a human being is created in the image and likeness of God. Therefore, the humanity, a human person resembles the personhood of God, or three persons of God, of the Trinity. It suggests that personhood, a unique existence of every human being, is more valuable than its kind of common dimension, that it's belonging to a group of people, than a person being a part of a mass, of a class of people. It suggested that a human being is not exhaustible, is not determinable, that the human being is beyond a comprehensive understanding. One philosopher compared a human person with a mirror. A mirror can reflect everything around it, but cannot reflect itself. You cannot go beyond mirror unless you are Alice. It means that the human person is something that reflects everything around us, but cannot be reflected, cannot be diminished, and cannot be framed by anything, by ideology, by philosophy, even by philosophy of personalism as such. They also suggested that human personality, an essential intrinsic feature of a human personality, is its relational character. That humans are humans only when they are in relationships, only when they are related to each other. Relationships make human beings personalities. Because of this, the idea of personhood became fitting the idea of the church, because the church is also a relationship. The church is a relationship between human beings, between human personalities. And since the essential feature of the human personality is relationship, it is also an essential feature of the church. That's how the idea of person was incorporated to the idea of the church, became a part of the idea of the church. And that's how personalistic ecclesiologies developed in the 20th century. Ecclesiologies that build the concept of the church on the concept of a human personhood as an ultimate value, as a relational function, as something that surpasses every sort of commonality, every sort of massive mass dimension, what makes people masses. Personhood exempts a human being from masses and makes this human being unique, even in the church. So this changed the character of how we began perceiving the church, and this became also a bridge between different traditions, because all traditions, Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, they agreed that personhood is important. Well, all traditions face the destructions of the world wars, the destructive effects of ideologies. All the churches had the same sort of experiences, bad experiences in the 20th century, and they realized that they need to evaluate human personhood more than anything else, and incorporated this idea to their perception of the church. And this kind of idea about the church as a sum of persons, as a community of persons, constituted this common perception, common language that helped different traditions to easier communicate with each other. So one thing was Eucharist, which became a common point of reference for different churches, and another common point of references for different churches was the idea of personhood. Both ideas, the idea of personhood and the idea of Eucharist, changed our perception about leadership and ministry. If it is person who is to be served in the church, then we completely rethink what is ministry and what is leadership. Then leadership is not about personhood. Personhood is such a value that it is more important than any leader in the church, any leadership in the church. Personhood is something which is to be served by a ministry, not to serve ministry. Okay? Does it make sense? The same is with Eucharist. Nothing in the church is about the Eucharist. Even the Pope is not about the Eucharist. Nothing in the church is to be regarded as contradicting Eucharist, as going against Eucharist. Everything should be in accordance with Eucharist, including ministry. And that's why ministry also concentrated around Eucharist. Essentially, ministering to community came to mean ministering the Eucharist as a gathering of people who partake of the same body and blood of Christ. Okay. And the third common point of reference in the ecclesiologies in the 20th century became the so-called communion ecclesiology. Communion ecclesiology comes from the word communion. Sometimes it is also referred to as the ecclesiology based on koinonia, a Greek word which means communion. And this word was accepted by all the traditions as their common basement, their common approach to the church. Communion ecclesiology means that what we value in the church primarily is our togetherness and our relationship. It is relevant, it is not far from the concept of the personhood, which is also relational. It is not far from the concept of Eucharist, which is about togetherness. However, it emphasizes more the fact, the event of being together more than anything else, as an essential feature of the church. These two approaches to the church, the Eucharistic and personalistic, were born primarily in the Catholic milieu and spread to other milieus, including the Orthodox. They became particularly popular in the Orthodox setting. This idea was initially Orthodox and became the favorite approach in the Catholic Church. It happened in the 1980s. Cardinal Ratzinger at the time, who later on became Pope Benedict XVI, he liked so much this idea of communion ecclesiology that he promoted it as the kind of main platform for the Catholic approach to ecumenism. So this third approach became favorite for the Catholic Church in the recent decades. All those approaches, they don't demand the churches to step out of their dwellings, step out of their houses. They provided a language which they feel as their own. They speak their own language. At the same time, that language that they speak can be understood also by other houses, as it were. So each tradition built its own ecclesiology. It remained with its own ecclesiological principles, with its own perceptions of the church. At the same time, those perceptions became more understandable in other traditions. And as I said in the beginning, an ecumenical ecclesiology tried to do something more. It tried to establish an ecclesiology, to build an ecclesiology which would be different from other ecclesiologies, not contradicting other ecclesiologies, but to be composed of the elements of other ecclesiologies and to stand as kind of a building on its own, as a structure, intellectual structure on its own. And this ecclesiology developed in the framework of the ecumenical movement, which we are going to discuss next.